There we are, getting the recording going. Super. So we'll be recording just the presentations. We won't be recording our sharing time or meditation time, but the presentations that I do will be recorded. So we'll be covering a lot of information. It'll be really helpful for you to be able to replay the recordings in the future too, because I am pretty sure that every time you watch it again, you'll get quite a bit more out of it. So I want to welcome each and every one of you to this workshop. You know, if you're here, it's because you seek a deeper relationship with God. And while this is ultimately a solo journey for each one of us, the opportunity to learn and to grow together as a group is indeed a very fortunate blessing to be able to do this together. So my goal this morning is to bring the deeply inspiring Cloud of Unknowing to life for you. I know several of you have read it or are reading it. One of you said you're at least trying to read it. It might be new to a few of you, but this morning's workshop will be an overview, okay? It will provide you with just a taste of this remarkable classic on contemplative prayer. Enough to inspire you to either read the book or to read it again with maybe a new depth of understanding. And also, hopefully it will inspire you to take my full 6-week course that I'll be offering on it this fall. I'll let you know more about that later on. While I'm presenting, I encourage you to post your questions and comments as we go along and post them in the chat here. Hopefully you know how to use the chat button and post any comments or questions that you have. It's likely that you'll forget them if you wait till the end of the presentation. And then when I get done during our discussion time, I can respond to those, okay? Now, this first slide presentation that I'm starting right now will last for about 45 minutes, somewhere in there. And then I'm going to lead you all in a short contemplative prayer practice, okay? After that, we'll open up the floor for questions and for sharing, and then we'll take about a 10-minute mid-morning break at that point. In the second half of our workshop, I'll share part 2 of my slide presentation. Then I'll lead you in another contemplative prayer practice. And after that, we'll spend the remaining time discussing. All right, so we've got a lot of ground to cover and depth and breadth. So let's be sure everyone's muted for now and go ahead and plunge in, okay? So just to give you a little background on the Cloud of Unknowing, back in the late 14th century, an anonymous English monk wrote a series of letters to a younger monk, advising him on how to directly experience the fathomless mystery of God, how to unite his soul, in other words, with God. And the result of those letters is the book, The Cloud of Unknowing. It's a very intimate, conversational, and deeply insightful guide on Christian contemplative prayer. And this is probably the most famous work on Christian contemplative prayer in the English language, and justifiably so. So this slide shows the first page of the manuscript in Middle English. The very first paragraph, that one with the decorated initial G there, is the prayer for the preface, okay? And the decorated initial I begins the first line of the preface that says, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." So thank goodness we have some really fine modern translations that make the wisdom of this remarkable treatise more available to us. Can you imagine trying to read it in Middle English? I'll be happy to suggest some of my favorite translations in a little while, but I wanted you to see what it looks like in the original Middle English. The basic premise of this book is that a cloud of unknowing separates us from God. And because the divine is beyond all human understanding, the author explains that God exists on the other side of this cloud of unknowing. Okay. Now, the image of the cloud is rooted in the biblical story of Moses, who heard, as you'll recall, many of you, that the voice of God spoke to him on Mount Sinai from within a cloud. So Moses walked towards the cloud on Mount Sinai until he was totally enveloped by it. Early Christian theologians understood Moses to be the first mystic when he stepped into the darkness of that cloud to be with and to commune with God. Okay, it's a beautiful image of how we can come to experience God within that cloud of unknowing. I like to say that we can refer to Moses as being the first to actually download data from the cloud to his tablet, right? Yeah. Just a little aside there. But the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing maintains that this cloud that separates us from God cannot be penetrated by our intellect, okay? It can only be penetrated by love. He says, God may be reached and held close by love, but never by thought. God allows us to know him only by loving him. And the author goes on to say that no matter how sacred, no thought can ever help us reach God, only love. So thinking about God doesn't cut it, does it? We connect with God only by loving God from deep within our heart of hearts. We can only meet God and experience God, not through book knowledge, not through intellectual knowing, but through the deepest, most divine love in our heart of hearts. And so in this book, the author is inviting us to leave our head knowing behind, okay? To be comfortable without that kind of knowing and to move into the cloud of unknowing so that we may meet God in our hearts via love. We're called to move beyond a purely conceptual relationship with God and Christ, and to live in love, both God's love for us and our awakening love for God. So our awareness of God's love for us and our love for God work together to draw us even deeper into the path of contemplation. Okay, but you might say, but what about us ordinary folk with ordinary lives who don't have the silence and calm routine of the monastery to help us on this contemplative path? You know, how do we move into this deeper space where we can move into the awareness of God's love and our love for God. How do we do that? Well, the author points out that you and I, and every soul ultimately, is called by God into this intimate union with Him so that we may be refashioned, refined, and reformed into God's likeness by His love. We don't have to be a monk living in a monastery, that this is something that we're all called. In the midst of our busy lives, we're all called to enter this holy of holies within our heart of hearts, where we can be one with God in love. Now, the author also reminds us that just like in every intimate relationship, our intimate relationship with God requires quality time in which we can be alone with Him, even if nothing seems to happen during that time except us gazing with love and longing upon God and feeling His loving and longing gaze upon us in return. Even if nothing seems to be happening during that time, just being alone with God is the quality time that is so important. All that's required of us is our presence in the silence, in the cloud of unknowing, in our innermost heart space. And so within that silence, God works in secret without us even knowing, okay? And that's probably a really good thing, because if we knew what God was doing in that deep place within, if we knew what He was doing, we would either get puffed up with pride, or we might run in fear. We might try to take control of the process, take the ball and run with it. Or we could simply even just close down to the whole mystery with our rational mind, trying to put it into rational terms and make sense of it that way. So it's really important that each of us learn to live in this cloud of our own unknowing, to be comfortable with not knowing, to be able to say, I don't know what God is doing, but God does, okay? And to trust that. So again, now the question arises, okay, so I'm ready, eager, and willing, you might say, but now what? How do I even begin to make this connection with God? How do I even begin to stretch myself toward God? Well, the author tells us that we need to start by lifting up our hearts to God with what he calls a gentle stirring of love. And in order to do this, we need to practice letting go of everything except for our patient love for God. Okay? He tells us even furthermore that when we let go of everything in our outer world and all of the thoughts in our mind and simply love God, simply move into that deeper space of loving God, that we'll discover a darkness. But he encourages us not to be afraid of that darkness. This darkness is the cloud of unknowing. It's the cloud that exists between us and God. And it appears dark only because God is so beyond anything in our normal, ordinary frame of reference. So we experience it as dark and empty when it's actually very full of the light and love of God, but it's just a totally different dimension than what we normally encounter in our ordinary consciousness or awareness. And so the author is teaching us to let go of all our notions of God, all our preconceived thoughts about God, our preconceived images of God. You might remember that in the Old Testament, God forbade the Hebrews to make any image of him, nor did he even allow them to give him a name. When he was asked his name, he simply replied, I am that I am. Okay? So by forbidding believers to define God, it became impossible for them to fall back on any preconceived notions of who God is. Okay, instead, God wanted them to come to know him through their own personal experience of him, not preconceived notions, not ideas that had been fed to them along the way, but their own personal experience of him. Likewise, it seems that even the beloved image and form that God chose for himself in Jesus, that too had its limitations. The human form of God allowed his disciples to only begin to grasp what the love of God is all about. Okay, and so Jesus told his disciples that he would leave them so that he could send the Holy Spirit, who would then lead them and all Christians into all truth. And he said that day would come soon if they would just wait, that it was important to wait and be patient, and that he would send his Spirit so that they wouldn't be limited to experiencing God only through the human form of Jesus. Okay? We must pass through this darkness, devoid of our preconceived notions, in order to know God as he truly is, in order to find God's divine light, that light that can only be found within spiritual darkness. And so it's through this cloud of unknowing that we will see God's true divine light, not the light of this world, the divine light of God. Perhaps this alone is enough encouragement for us to persist in this darkness, to remember the importance of waiting and trusting that God will never leave us in the cloud of unknowing, that he will come to us in a way we can't begin to imagine, in a way that's entirely of his doing, that will enlighten us in a way that we could never achieve by our own efforts. And so, though God's light is hidden from us for now, we must trust that as long as we persevere, an unseen, imperceptible current will draw us toward the light. And this is a current that's moved by love, our love for God and God's love for us, and that which will eventually draw us into his marvelous divine light. It's almost as if a magnet is pulling us into that. And when that happens, it will make all of our time in the darkness worthwhile. In the meantime, it's important that we accept the darkness, okay? That we accept it, that we acknowledge it and open to it. The author assures us that we must persevere in loving God, even if we don't feel like we're getting anywhere, okay? He urges us to, quote, make our home in this darkness. He says it's the closest we can get to God here on earth by waiting in this darkness and in this cloud. And eventually, he says, our love for God will result in the vision we desire. God will draw us into his light and let us glimpse him. In this life, we won't see him fully. Our eyes would surely be burned by his full glory. But God will give us a glimpse. And so the author continues to remind us that we have to move from the thoughts in our head to the love in our heart. Okay, so thinking about God, reading about him, praying with words, those are all very well and good, but they simply won't take us toward the truth of experiencing God. To truly know God, we have to go beyond using words and images, beyond conceptualizing and imagining, beyond reflecting and speculating about God. We must go into that silent mystery of God's divine presence in our heart of hearts. And so we need to let go of all thoughts, all images, all ideas, even the most holy and beautiful thoughts that you could ever think. So we're not even to think about God or Christ or saints or angels. That would mean we're still in our head, okay? And God's not in your head. God's waiting to meet you in your heart. He's always there, always has been, always will be. And the author of The Cloud tells us that love is what takes us from our head to our heart, okay? From cogitating to contemplation. It's not some technique that we employ to do that. It's love. Receiving God's love, loving God, okay? St. John, in his first letter, says that God is love. And whoever lives in love lives in God. And God lives in him. Such loving oneness with God, the Cloud author says, is a, quote, taste of eternal sweetness. After all, we don't enter the cloud of unknowing in order to gain an intellectual understanding of God. Rather, we do so simply to love God. Okay, again, we approach God not through the thinking mind, but through the loving heart. Okay, love alone can guide us through the dark cloud of unknowing. Only love. And so the Cloud author says that we're to use what he calls the arrows of our longing love to pierce the cloud of unknowing. Our love and longing for God is what pierces that cloud. I'd like to play a couple of minutes of this video just to give you a sense from another voice of what I'm talking about here.
The idea, you see, is that the Cloud of Unknowing is the title of the book. It means that there's a kind of we can't, with our finite minds, we can't encompass God completely. There's a kind of a cloud of unknowing between us. But we can pierce the cloud of unknowing with love. Love is the one thing that can pierce the cloud. So by sending out arrows of love, this was the author of the Cloud of Unknowing, we pierce that cloud of unknowing and we make direct contact with God. So whatever helps you to do that. I say to the Lord sometimes when I'm praying, I say, although I'm not feeling particularly fervent at the moment, I say, Lord, it's not a gushy, it's not emotional, it's not gush and emotional, but I'm actually feeling, I very much want to send out to you these arrows of love and gratitude to you for all that you've given me and for this beautiful universe and world that we're living in. So I'm sending out now, even if I get completely distracted in 5 minutes' time, I'm continuing to sit here and send out these arrows of love to you, piercing this cloud. I'm battering the cloud of unknowing between us, piercing it, I'm battering it. So I do say that, you know. I think it's quite a good idea, you know. I can't encompass you with my mind, you're way beyond it, but we're told love is the one thing that makes direct contact between a human being and God. And that keeps you going.
So how exactly do we let go of the thoughts and images in our heads? Well, the Cloud author recommends using a sacred word, okay? Preferably one simple word, such as God or love. It could be a word like joy or peace or hope. It could be Christ or Abba. Whatever word best symbolizes your love for God. The sacred word gathers all the love we have for God, gathers all of that love into itself, and becomes like our sword, that arrow that pierces through the cloud of unknowing. So during our contemplative prayer time, we're to return to this word, return to repeating this word whenever our mind starts to wander. Okay, with this sacred word, we can simultaneously detach from our thoughts and fill our heart with love for God. We simply love God in and through the darkness. So let go of all those distracting thoughts and anxious voices in your head. Let go of them, detach from them during your time of contemplative prayer, and simply love God with all your heart and soul. Okay, it's not that we're trying to stop the thoughts or to stop anything. It's just that we don't stay connected with it. We don't stay caught up in those thoughts or even the sensations that we're feeling in our bodies or the sounds that we're hearing around us. We detach from all of that, not trying to stop them. I don't think we can stop our thoughts. Okay, our brain is designed to think, isn't it? And it does a pretty good job of it in most of our cases. So we're not trying to stop the thoughts or the sensations or the sounds in our environment. We're just not getting caught up in them. Okay, we're detaching from them and staying in our heart of hearts where we simply love God with all our heart and soul. Now understand, this is very important. There's nothing wrong with using our intellect to understand God. There's nothing wrong with thinking about God or with meditating on scripture. There's nothing wrong with praying and singing with words. So at no time should we ever abandon our intellectual approach to prayer and to God. Okay, that's a really important part of our spiritual growth. But there does come a time when we're called to move beyond relating to God only in our heads and to move into our hearts where we can actually experience God, where we can embrace God in love, where we can simply love God in the holy silence, in the darkness of the cloud. It's our love and our longing for God in our heart of hearts that allows us to enter the cloud where God's love will draw us close to Him. God will do the rest. Now, in this process, our contemplative loving of God has the effect of banishing, destroying any sin in us. And at the same time, it nurtures the virtues. As the Cloud author puts it, contemplative prayer not only pulls out the roots of sin, but it grows goodness in its place. You see, all virtues are found in contemplation because all virtue stems from our deliberate love for God. After all, God, divine love, is the pure source of every virtue. In particular, the Cloud author focuses quite a bit on the virtue of humility. Humility is our awareness that without God's grace, we're nothing. That without God's breath breathing us, we're but dust. And that if our heart and mind are disconnected from God's love, then we remain empty shells. And so in maintaining an awareness of our own humility, we find a really deep relief, a deep freedom. We step out of the rat race of, for example, comparing ourselves to others, and we simply rest in the sense of our inherent worth that we have from God, where we have no need to prove ourselves to others. Here's something that strikes me regarding humility and contemplative prayer. You know, so often we can be sitting in contemplative prayer and think, okay, so enough of this, I need to get going. I have way too much to do. Have any of you ever thought that? I have. But the thing is, can you imagine sitting in the presence of Jesus or any of the world's great spiritual masters and thinking that? Can you imagine being in the presence of the divine and deciding that you need to scamper off because of something on your to-do list? I don't think we'd ever do that. And yet contemplative prayer is just that. It's sitting in the presence of God. How can anything be more important than that? Whether he's talking directly to us or not, we just want to be near him, right? We just want to be in his energy field, just to be in his presence, just to soak up his goodness and love. And so we really need to humble ourselves before God when we sit in contemplation. We simply need to be quiet, to be still, and to be humble, in humble awe of being in God's presence. In contemplative prayer, then, we're not seeking a burning bush experience. We're not trying to arrive at some profound insight about God. We're simply seeking to accept the gift of being in God's holy presence and to respond to that as fully as we can. To do this, we learn to be still. Contemplative prayer teaches us to be still, to be silent, and to be truly humble. In the biblical story of Mary and Martha, Mary developed humility by simply sitting at the feet of Christ, beaming her tender affection upon the one who embodied God's love. The church has always seen this beautiful gospel story as symbolic of the contemplative and the active aspects of our loving search for God. Mary, of course, is the contemplative. She's sitting quietly in the presence of Jesus with adoration, as you can see in this painting through the doorway in the background there. While Martha serves Jesus in an active way. She's preparing the house and the dinner. And so in our own loving search for God, we're both Mary and Martha. There are times when we're called to love God in contemplative prayer. And there are times when we have to be busy taking care of ourselves and of others. And there's no doubt that both of these ways, the contemplative and the active, both please God. After all, when Martha is in the kitchen baking bread and roasting a leg of lamb, cutting up figs and grapes, opening up an amphora of wine and setting out the tableware, she's doing just fine. She's a busy woman. After all, the author points out that the contemplative life cannot exist without the active life. Okay, the active life is a platform. It provides a solid base for contemplative living. And likewise, contemplative prayer is not meant to replace other kinds of more active prayer. Rather, it adds a very rich depth of meaning to the more active modes of prayer, whether it's verbal, mental, sung, or liturgical. Jesus does make it clear, however, that while he certainly recognizes the need for both of these aspects, the contemplative and the active. His preference is the loving, contemplative Mary. Okay. As he says in Luke chapter 10, he says, Martha, Martha, you were worried and upset about so many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. And Mary has chosen what's best, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, there's a good reason for choosing the contemplative as being the best. It's a good reason for this, and that is that the love we encounter in contemplative prayer is primary, and all of our activity must proceed from it, from that place of deep, contemplative, divine love. The Cloud author reminds us that when we sit in the presence of God like Mary did, we'll often hear the voice of Martha in our heads, complaining and urging us away from this most important work. Our inner Martha will want us to stop, quote, doing nothing and to get busy with all the work that needs to be done. We can all relate to this. And so when this happens, and it will, let God calm the anxieties and complaints of the Martha in your head, okay? Just allow those complaints and anxieties to pass on by like clouds in the sky, and simply continue sitting silently in God's presence. The author also explores the reciprocal love of Jesus and Mary, which he describes as an exceptional love. Mary's exceptional love for Jesus models the love that we as contemplatives have for God. And likewise, the exceptional love of Jesus for Mary models the love that God has for us. And so in contemplative prayer, we experience this personal, exceptional love within us, our love for God and God's love for us. Contemplative prayer emphasizes this deeply intimate relationship with God. It's a relationship that moves us beyond conversation with God and into communion with God, where we're given the gift of gazing at the one we love as he in turn gazes at us. And so in contemplative prayer, this reciprocal gaze and love become one. It's a sort of divine union in which it's no longer me loving God or God loving me. It's simply love, loving. Meister Eckhart so famously said, "The eye with which I see God is exactly the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowledge, and one love." To see this oneness, though, it's necessary to see from oneness with the eye of the heart, okay, not from the eye of the mind. It's a different way of seeing. It's sometimes thought of in terms of seeing with the mind of God or seeing with the mind of Christ. Now, the author assures us that amazing things happen in our relationships with other people as we grow in a regular practice of contemplative prayer. Our love for God deepens through contemplative prayer, and as that deepens, so does our love for others. You see, contemplative prayer truly changes us. Our experience of being one with God in love changes our hearts and instills in us a sense of oneness with others. We begin to carry an awareness of God's presence within us at all times, and we begin to see God in others as well. We begin viewing others from a more divine perspective, more than from a human perspective. And so we start loving others as God loves them. We deem friend and foe alike to be worthy of the same loving attention. In other words, we love sacrificially as Christ did, seeking salvation for all, not just for ourselves. So the love and the connection that we're increasingly experiencing with God in our contemplative prayer naturally begins to extend to all others. We are, after all, one in the body of Christ. It's important in this process to remember that at the innermost heart of every human being lies the spark of God, that image of God in which He created us. It's at that innermost core that every one of us, regardless of our deeds, regardless of our behavior, that every one of us at that innermost core is one with God in love. And so even though we're totally free to judge others' behavior, we must do it from a place of love, of recognition that at their core lives God, their creator. And it's God who will be their ultimate judge. Okay. Now, along this line, I'd like to insert here an important insight about forgiveness. There are situations in life that we may find humanly impossible to forgive, especially if it's been an evil done to someone we love. In this case, forgiveness requires something much greater than ourselves. In these cases, we can forgive not from our own meager and limited love, but only from the unlimited compassion of God's love. And so we must enter into the heart of God at our innermost core in contemplative prayer. Only then can we go full circle and return to the world imbued with the love of Christ and empowered with the grace of His Holy Spirit. Only then can we forgive, not of our own power, but of God's power. It's very important to know this about forgiveness. This is where we can enter into a radical forgiveness, a complete forgiveness, but only in and with God. The Cloud author also points out that in the beginning, you're likely to find that sitting in contemplative prayer will certainly stir up activity in your mind. It's often called the monkey mind, right? With thoughts swinging like crazy through your head. There may even be times where you feel like you're under attack by thoughts and distractions rushing in from all directions, pushing and shoving and vying for your attention. And so you'll need to use the energy of love and the power of your sacred word to stomp down this cocktail party in your head, as it's been called. But this, the author admits, still may not be enough. Our battle with the onslaught of thoughts may be so hard that we may need a few spiritual tricks to make progress. And he suggests 2 spiritual tactics in particular that may prove especially helpful in taming your busy mind. I inserted this because I think we can all relate to this, that here's someone saying to her teacher, I'm meditating on my inability to meditate due to the fact that when I meditate, I can't stop thinking about how I can't meditate because I'm thinking about my inability to meditate. Is that correct? I know I can relate to that. It seems like thoughts can be relentless at times. And so the first tactic that we can use to tackle these thought storms is this. When distracting thoughts press down on you, when they stand between you and God and stubbornly demand your attention, the first tactic is to simply pretend you don't even notice them. Don't honor them by paying attention to them. Try looking over their shoulders as though they were people standing in your way when you're trying to see something beyond them. Look right over and beyond them. That something beyond your thoughts is God, hidden in a cloud of unknowing. So look beyond the thoughts and return your attention to God in your heart of hearts. Just quietly and gently allow your love for God, symbolized by your sacred word, to continue issuing forth from your heart. The second tactic is really an old combat maneuver that's used when all else fails in battle. And that is, of course, to simply quit fighting all of those thoughts and give up, surrender to God. So when it becomes apparent that not one more repetition of your sacred word is going to help, it's likely time to try letting go of letting go, to give up and wave the white flag of surrender. In doing so, we accept our own spiritual poverty, our own ultimate powerlessness. We see who we truly are before God, and we become truly humble. We learn to gently melt into the ocean of God's endless love for us. We let go, okay? The good news is that such surrender and humility gets God's attention and brings us peace. God is like a good earthly father that constantly looks out for his little ones, especially when we become lost in the woods. And so in contemplative prayer, God swoops in and snatches us up, carries us in his arms, and dries our spiritual eyes. This is true humility. This is how we stand before God, needing God's help. And God will respond. God will come and embrace you. So don't give up. For the love of God, literally, don't give up on your contemplative prayer practice. Don't look for benefits or rewards. Remember that love begins when nothing is expected in return. So enjoy the benefits of your prayer practice when they're given, but don't look for them or become attached to them. Seek God for God, not for his gifts. I love this quote by Yogananda, who says, "A saint is a sinner who never gave up." Okay, never gave up. So are you beginning to get it? That this book, The Cloud of Unknowing, is essentially a treatise on love. Okay, that eternal, infinite, unconditional, divine love is what this is all about. That divine love for which we all yearn and for which God yearns for us to accept from Him. And so again, now that you've begun this loving search for God, don't give up. Keep in mind that true love happens when we expect nothing in return. For this reason, our cloud author tells us this. He says, "I encourage you to bow eagerly to love. Follow its humble stirrings in your heart. Let it guide you in this life, and it will bring you safely to eternal bliss in the next. Love is the essence of all goodness." So, I'd like to offer you a little taste, just a short one for now, of contemplative prayer, okay? We'll do a little longer version of this toward the end of the workshop, but just to get you started, I'll guide you in this abbreviated version. And then after the meditation, we'll open up the floor for questions and comments, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, okay? So if you don't already have a sacred word that you use, if this is new for you, start by choosing your prayer word, a sacred word. It can be one of the ones shown here in this slide, or it can be one of your own choosing, whatever draws you close to God. Okay, and invest that word with all the love you have for God. And so remember that this time of contemplative prayer is a time to simply rest in God, to be open-hearted, open with your whole being, and to consent to God's presence and action within you. So let's start by finding a sitting position that allows you to be comfortable yet alert. However you choose to sit, try to do so with your back straight and your head balanced on top of your spine so that your head's not leaning too far forward or falling backward. It's just perfectly balanced on top of your shoulders. And if you're comfortable, you might go ahead and close your eyes. Let them just relax back into their sockets for now as you bring your attention to your inner world for now. Now take a few slow, deep breaths, breathing all the way into your body, filling your lungs and expanding your stomach. And then slowly exhaling, relaxing, letting go, settling in more and more with each breath. Breathing in relaxation and breathing out any tension or stress that might be in your body. Now let your breath just become natural for now. Just allowing your breath to breathe all by itself, not trying to control it or change it, just becoming aware, just noticing your body breathing. And now take a few moments to settle into your inner world and totally relax, starting at the top of your head. Relax your brow, just feeling it smooth out as you let go of any tension there. And if you haven't already, you might gently close your eyes. Let them rest back in their sockets. Nothing to see for now in your outer world, just focusing on your inner world. Relaxing your jaw, letting it drop down just a bit. Maybe even allowing your lips to form a slight smile. Now allow your shoulders to drop down as well, away from your neck. As you let go of any responsibilities that you might be shouldering for now. Bring your attention now on down into your hands and then on into your fingers, relaxing them, just letting them rest for now. No need to hold on to anything, nothing to grasp or reach for. Now very calmly and lovingly begin to silently repeat your prayer word, realizing that with this word, you're embracing God in your deepest love. So allow yourself to simply relax in the presence of God, who dwells deep within you, opening to God and surrendering all that you are to God in this moment. And whenever your mind wanders, use your sacred word to gently let go of thoughts or feelings or anything that's distracted you from your place of surrender to God. Just offering up all that you are in childlike trust and surrender to God for the next 2 minutes. And now, as we end this time of contemplative prayer, gradually begin to bring your attention back to the room you're in, back to your outer world. And when you're ready, slowly open your eyes. So I'll get out of screen share now, and let's spend these next few minutes sharing whatever you're noticing about your centering prayer or about anything I've talked about in my presentation. And I will check on chat to see